Welcome back to the Faith Forward podcast. John Ackerman, and joining me today, Mike Haynes.
Woo!
Our director of high school ministry here at CFC. And if you were here on Sunday or watched the message, which you're always supposed to do first, just friendly reminder, you saw him this Sunday morning as we're continuing in the series called Alien Living. And Brian and I were joking for the last couple of weeks that it's hard to believe that we've spent this much time talking about suffering. I mean, frankly, just nobody enjoys that at all. And so this Sunday was really kind of fun because you gave us a little break from suffering to talk about something harder.
Yeah, much harder than suffering, actually. Much harder to implement. And of course, because you all watched the message first.
Everybody did.
And everyone did. Then you're aware that we really did open up the message talking about a different kind of suffering that I went through personally.
Right. And, that was such a good story. So again, there's your plug. If you've been faking it through the first minute and a half of this episode, you need to go watch the Sunday service. I won't say if only, because it was a phenomenal message, but you need to hear the opening story. And we're not going to tell it to you here.
No, we're not.
No. But as we so often do, because we know that sometimes people do access this first for whatever reason. I'm still unclear as to why, but some people do. Mike, can you give us sort of the 2-3 minute high level highlight version of what you talked about Sunday morning?
Yeah, essentially we all choose for one reason or another. We often choose to kind of put on a facade. We choose to show only bits and pieces of ourselves to different groups of people. You know, you've got the boss, hat, and you've got these different hats that we wear, and we all do this, and we do it naturally. And some of that is probably very normal and good and healthy. It makes a lot of sense. But there's also the reality that this is a very human thing that we do.
Yeah.
And whenever there is a behavior that we do that seems like there's any hint of unhealthy or disordered in it, and it's a thing that everyone in humanity does, it's worth taking a look at, especially in the context of this series on alien living. And so, basically, this morning we just talked about the fact that when Peter decides to talk a little bit less about suffering and a little bit more about something else, he kind of transitions us into this topic of love very briefly. And the way that he does that is, I think, a little unorthodox. It's we often think of love as an action, but Peter chose to kind of frame it up more so as revelation of yourself, that love is a means by which you show and share more of who you are with others around you for their benefit. And so we talked about essentially the difference between head and heart. We talked a little bit about that, and in your prayer life, just being more earnest with people, being a little bit less guarded, and sharing a little bit more of who you are and the way that God has created you, and that is the mechanism by which we grow from regular love as an action love, which is still biblical and good, but into a deeper love that actually enables us, our love for them covers a multitude of sins, is the way that Peter puts it. And I think that kind of love is the kind of love that shares more of who we are and doesn't hide, doesn't put on a facade, doesn't fake it. So that's essentially what we talked about this morning. Yeah.
So again, you need to go back and check out the message. Hit pause, turn us off. We'll wait. We're not going anywhere. We live in the internet forever now. But go check it out. But as always, the goal with Faith Forward podcast, practical application. Nuts and bolts, ABCs, how do I do the thing? And what was one of the things, there were so many things, and this is not just hyping up my friend, it's actually a phenomenal message. There were so many things that were inherently practical in what you talked about. We didn't spend a lot of time up in the ether of theology. We spent a lot of time here on planet Earth of what does deep love look like? What does deep love look like between me and God? What does deep love look like between me and the people around me? What does deep love look like between me and the people around me that I frankly wish weren't around me? And so we're going to try to get real practical on this episode, as we try to do with every episode. And as always, in advance, here's just our blanket disclaimer. If we say things that don't make sense, if we say things you love a lot, if we say things that make you want to share a little bit of your story with us, reach out, faithforward@cfcwired.org. I'll even make Mike respond to the emails this week.
Oh,
congratulations.
Thank you so much.
You didn't even know that was part of guest appearance on the podcast.
So excited.
Yeah. Send a lot, please. So one of the things you touched on just in the summary was this notion that we're going to get to deep love with others in a little bit, but this notion of our connection with God and this notion of facade, of having a mask on, of not actually giving our whole heart to God, giving a part of ourselves. And this notion of wrapping our head around the idea of praying with discipline, but the deeper and more important part of wrapping our heart around the idea of praying earnestly. And that if we don't even know what that means, where do we go? But more importantly, are you aware? Are you even aware? Is it a place you spend any time considering where you're intentionally holding yourself back from God? Or is this more of a hidden thing where you don't even know you're doing it? So, Mike, talk a little bit about what this has looked like for you personally. What were some of the things that were coming up in your mind as you were putting together this section of the message?
Yeah, I mean, the big thing for me is when I was in college, I, in my faith development, went through a phase where I started to shift from viewing God as like a I'm going to ask and then hopefully I get my wish.
Right.
I started to really develop in college some confidence in God, just confidence that he was going to come through.
Yeah.
And I started to develop kind of a dynamic of I'm already thanking God for the thing that I want to ask him for. I'm not even going to ask, I'm just going to thank him for doing it. And it was just this kind of phase in my faith where I was starting to develop that confidence that God not only was capable of coming through, but that he was going to. And so, in that, there was a lot of good. There was so much good that came out of that phase, that kind of building block of my faith. But there was also, I think, unintentionally, it resulted in starting from that point and kind of growing worse and worse as I got older and older. I kind of stopped asking God for things because at first it was I stopped asking God for things because I was thanking him for them. But then it grew to I stopped asking God for things because whether he did it or not, whether he came through for me in the way that I wanted him to or not, I had decided that I was just going to be appreciative, grateful, and faithful in trusting that his plan is best. Yeah. And so because it's this predeterminism, that whole aspect of faith, right? Yeah. Where I know that God is capable and I know that he has a plan and I know that he's going to do what he sees fit, I kind of stopped asking. And so recently, my family, my wife and I, we've been just in a very personal, very practical level. We've been trying to acquire some land in our backyard. And it's one of those things where we didn't know that the land was available. And then we found out it was kind of available and we asked the purchaser for it. And we expected them to give us a price. We asked the owner for, the land, and we expected them to give us a huge price. Yeah. And they basically said, pay us a couple pennies. We don't want the land anymore. Sure. We've been looking for a reason to offload it. Yeah. And so to us, it was this, adding like value to our property, giving ourselves more space, for our family and for the thousands of kids in the neighborhood who come and play every day. It felt like this is the greatest blessing of God. Like, you know what I mean? It's just one of those things where we will sing of his praises about this. And so that initial process of acquiring that land began in July of 2022. And so we anticipated that it was going to be we sign a piece of paper, we pay the person, the land is ours, and hooray. We just increased our property value by a ton. And now we're 7-8 months past that, and we've had to, this is our first time navigating it. We kind of have to work with the county, and we got to dig into the laws. And, my wife knows more about land ordinances and, easements and stuff like that I think she would have ever known, but we're so far into this process and it has not gone according to plan. It's been expensive. The land itself is not expensive, but the lawyer that we have had to pay to help us navigate this has been expensive. And, we're 8 months into this, and I realized recently, after writing this message, actually, kind of taking inventory of my own situation, I realized I haven't really talked with God that much about this, and I've got some complaints. you know?
Yeah.
And so allowing myself, I think when we talk about being earnest with God and praying, not just with discipline, but with earnesty, you know, there's been a season of life just in this past week where I have finally allowed myself to express some feelings to God about the way that this has gone, in a way that is very real and very raw. Yeah. And I think that that's really healthy. I think that's really good. And I know that
Absolutely.
that when we think about deep love, we don't necessarily think about negative feelings that we have, but that earnestness is, I think, opening up a chamber of my heart toward God that I had closed off for a very long time because, you know, of trust or whatever, right? And so I think that that's how that's looked for me lately. It's been very personal, very important.
That's such a great example, and I think that probably resonates with a lot of people, this notion of either, God, you're just going to do whatever you're going to do, and so I don't really need to be actively involved in anything other than just doing what you want me to do whenever you tell me. But this idea of, just like with any other relationship, right? If there's things that you're holding back because they're uncomfortable or they're awkward, or it has an effect on the relationship. Like it just does. Like if you did that with your wife, Anna, or any close friendship, or like eventually people can start to tell, they're like, it just feels like there's this space. What's up with that? And I think we lose track of, it actually works the same way with God. And I mean, I resonate so much with that story because that's so similar to how I feel like I was first with God. Mm-hmm. Like when I go back to me being a kid and it was just like, oh, God's cool and I'm a little and I don't really understand, but yay, there's this big God and he does fun things and this is great. And then some life happened, and some really hard life happened. And then it sort of turned into, all right, God, you be up there and do your God thing, and I guess the rest is up to me. Mm-hmm. And really lost the heart. And then sort of came back to a place of, all right, God, I'll talk to you about some things, but there's some hurt here and there's some frustration, but you're God. And so I'm just supposed to swallow it. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't until I finally got to some of those places with God of, this is actually a barrier. This is actually keeping me from being closer to you. And you already know about it. Yeah. Right? I've done a horrible job of hiding this from you because frankly, you're God and you're like the master of hide and seek. And it just, you can't win that one. So it's actually the best thing for the relationship to.
Well, I think too, like it's one of those things where when you allow yourself to just be open, like I just think that it's this floodgate that then opens up. Yeah. And now not only in that particular area where you've opened up, are you now conversing with God on a different level, but now there's other areas of your life that maybe you hadn't even considered, or you hadn't thought about before, and you're like, I haven't been real with God about this over here either, right? And so it's when you can do that with one thing, where you can just pick that one thing and then just be real with God about it. And the other thing about it too is, I hate being wrong. I feel like I hate being wrong.
I don't have that problem at all.
Well, yeah, you don't, and they obviously you guys don't have that problem. But I'm flawed, and I hate being wrong, and I especially hate being wrong about Christian stuff because that's like it's like my job. I'm supposed to do the Christian stuff, and so I don't like approaching God when I know that I'm wrong, or I know that my perspective is finite.
That's good.
That's always in the back of my mind. I'm like, I know that my perspective's finite. I know that you're God. I know the right answer. And so getting over that, like inviting us to get over that, like get over God's always right. Like just allow yourself to be human for a second. Yeah. And that's something that I've been processing lately.
That's good. So practical step number one, we don't always number them, but sometimes we do, just to keep it interesting for me, frankly. So practical step number one is, and again, we try not to go real far into the show without saying it at least once, ask God. Mm-hmm. But if you already know where you're withholding things from God, then like you said, just pick one and just be real about it. And I think quite often part of what holds us back on this is there's this innate assumption that it has to be a sin thing. Like a classically religious church sin thing. And it may actually be frustration. Yeah. It may actually be disappointment. It may actually be desires, good desires, kingdom desires that you've been suppressing because you've just not seen opportunities for it to manifest itself in the world around you. And it's killing you. It's killing you. And it's killing your relationship with God. And so if you're already aware of it, pick one and just have that conversation. Open up with them. If you don't know, and I promise you, friends, there are aspects of you that you aren't aware you're withholding from God or from other people, frankly. Ask him to show you, and don't let that be a one-time question. Let that become part of your rhythm for a week, a couple weeks, a month, a couple times a week over several months. Ask him to show you. And even in just the asking, I promise you that he will reveal things that you hadn't realized, or he'll reveal new depths of things that you thought you had already addressed, because as is always the case with God, there's always more.
Yeah.
Always. So another thing we want to talk about, as we're improving this relationship with God, right? We never have to get this fully realized before we go out and do anything else, nor do we make the relationship with God the last thing and go love people first. Right? It's both and. So as we're improving our relationship with God, we also want to love the people around us well. And so this is where you were drawing the distinction between love for people and deep love. And you were talking specifically about, going out and giving of yourself and your stuff. And you said something along the lines of, you can share your thing with somebody, tangible thing, emotional thing, relational thing, whatever, as just sort of a headway of, I'm following Jesus, so I'm supposed to give stuff to people. So, here you go, enjoy, I hope you choke on it, whatever. Not that you'd ever say that, but there's this deeper place of cheerfully, as Peter says, cheerfully share your thing. And so again, at practical application, how did you get there? How do we get there? How do we make that shift?
Yeah, a huge shift for me has in recent years has been that far less of what I do now is about the other person. And that sounds so counterintuitive.
That's really good.
That sounds so counterintuitive. It's like, oh, you're supposed to be about other people. You're supposed to care about other people. But I really do less and less based on the other person, because it's about them and it's for them, but really it's about me. Like, really it's about who I am and who Christ is making me into. And so I think a big difference, it's allowed me to do more things, share more things cheerfully, because it almost doesn't, like it's not that it's selfish, it's just, this is because this is coming out of the overflow of who I am and who Jesus is making me into, not because of this specific person in front of me. Yeah. You could almost replace that person with anybody else, and the feeling would be the same because it's not about them. That's not the most important variable. And so that's been a really important shift for me, has been a shift toward operating not out of, how has that person treated me or who are they, but more so out of my identity in Christ. And so that's been a really big shift for me.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. And again, some of you may have already queued up an email here because, you heard this idea of, the feeling matters, right? Cheerfully is actually more important than just do the thing.
Yep.
And you're like, but it's not always about a feeling. Love isn't always a feeling. Sure. Love is an action. So, crack,
Sure.
And Mike was about to get like 15 emails. And so I may actually be preventing the thing that I was joyously expecting, which was Mike getting a ton of fan mail. But I thought you really hit this well in the message, which was, it's, as is so often the case with God, it's both and.
Yeah.
That loving others does involve some component of, maybe I'm not feeling it, and so I need to do it. Mm-hmm. I need to do it even if the feeling of love isn't there. Mm. But I love the way you pulled this thing out, that Peter's invitation is cheerfully, that the feeling matters too, and the cultivation of the feeling matters. And so very practically, if you're not feeling it, then start doing it anyway.
Yeah. But
start doing it with an intentional focus of getting to the feeling.
Yeah.
That's as important, because as you said, this is about you.
Yeah.
This is not just about them regardless of you. This is about you and them.
Yep.
And so this takes us to an even deeper place of loving people we don't like.
Yeah.
Right? What's the practical 1, 2, 3 on that one, Pastor? But realistically, like this is, loving people that we're fond of, even mildly fond of. The action and the cultivation of the feeling. I feel like that's not too difficult a road, especially as you're continuing to cultivate the parts of yourself that you're withholding, both from God and from others. But getting to this place of, I don't like you. Or not only I don't like you because you've hurt me. Mm-hmm. And I'm supposed to get to cheerfully. Mm-hmm. That's a little bit more than a 1, 2, 3. But again, what does that look like for you, or what does that look like for any of us as we try to make that shift with people that frankly we just struggle to feel any affection for?
Yeah, and this gets difficult too, because there's a tension. Maybe this is better for a little later in the conversation, but there really is a tension about sharing more of yourself with somebody who is not trustworthy.
Yes.
Right? Like there's a caveat that I didn't mention in the message, but it belongs in discussions. Mm-hmm. You don't want to open up more of yourself to somebody who is, for instance, an abusive person, mm-hmm. toxic person. The more you open yourself up to them, the more that they will twist that and use that to hurt you.
Yep.
There's caveats here.
Yep.
Generally speaking, I think when we do this, we find ourselves not dealing with an abusive or toxic person. It's just someone we just don't like.
Sure.
And so there's room for that discussion about abuse and toxicity and stuff like that. That's important, and we need to have that discussion. And if we're not having it here, then that's worth you all having at home, having in your small groups, community groups, things like that. But
or emailing Mike,
or just emailing me and just yell at me, and that's fine. But for people that we just don't like, we'd say all the time in church, like, you don't have to like people in order to love them. You don't have to like them. You don't have to like them in order to love them. And I think that's true. I do. I'm not saying that's not true. That's good. But I do think it's interesting that Jesus seemed to like a lot of people.
Yeah.
There were like very few people that Jesus didn't like. Like he loved as an action. But then you look at the way that he interacted with people, and this dude seemed to genuinely like people mm-hmm. who were not genuinely liked mm-hmm. by most people. And there was this reason that Jesus found an emotional, positive connection with unlikable people. Mm-hmm. And I think that the key there, I would imagine, Scripture doesn't come out and say, here's why Jesus liked Matthew, the thieving, traitorous, greedy tax collector. Scripture doesn't come out and say that, right? But when I look at Jesus and I look at the fact that he's the God of the universe, he's all-knowing, when I look at the fact that the way that he treated people, the way he contextualized their story, I'm just like, when you know that no one is evil in a vacuum, it
right.
changes the way you feel about them.
Right.
That's true of every movie we've ever seen. Mm-hmm. When the villain has no backstory, we hate them. But when we realize the villain has a very painful backstory, all of a sudden we feel something. Yeah. And it primes the pump for the redemption of that villain for the movies and stories that feature a redemption arc. Right. And so we want that. We crave that. We love that. But it starts with understanding, or at least imagining or trying to intuit their story. And I think when we can intuit the stories, or start to see peel back the layers on someone and see what's behind their unlikable behavior, the cheerful comes. It comes, even if we are going to do something based on other people instead of it solely being based on who we are. If it's going to be based on other people a little bit, we're going to find a better path toward that when we understand and know their story.
I love the idea of the villain backstory, right? That context matters, right? And we say that so often here about so many things, and it's always true. Context matters. And I really appreciated where you started with it, that there's there's layers, there's degrees, there's categories here. That this is not just blanket invitation to dive into unhealthy relational interaction with people that are fundamentally unsafe, right? And so again, we always bring this back to ask God. Yep. It is not your job. It's not your job to go save the world and everybody in it, yep. Right? That job has been filled. It's pretty well covered. He's doing well. So this is more, like you said earlier, it's as much about your continued growth and transformation and change as it is about the effect that your growth and transformation and change will have on the world around you, right? Bringing yourself, the fullness of yourself, to others. And so again, there's some practical things that we can begin to navigate. Do not rush out the door to try to go love everybody the same way at the same time to the same depth. It's just not healthy. But there may be some people that do not fall into the abusive, toxic category, but that have still been a source of pain or frustration or resentment in your life. And so we've talked about this in the last 2 episodes, and we're bringing it back again. And this is where we sort of intermingle deep love with suffering, because it means addressing our pain. Yep. It means that on some level, in some places, we're going to have to get to those things that we've been withholding, perhaps from God, certainly from that other person, and maybe even from ourselves. This place of bitterness, this place of resentment, this place of anger, this place of, dare we say the word, hatred and rage at what happened, and begin to release that. And so whenever we talk about forgiveness, we have to offer a couple of caveats, because forgiveness has been taught so poorly since childhood. In fact, when you had whatever childhood, thing you did, and somebody grabbed you and grabbed the other person and said, say you're sorry, now say you forgive them, now go play and don't bother me. That's not forgiveness. It's not. Rather, we need to get to that place of bitterness and pain and resentment. And we need to go to God. We don't need to go to the other person first. We need to go to God and say, I'm carrying this, and if I'm being honest, I'm holding on to it because it makes me feel safe. It's not a warm, snuggly safe. It's like a spiny, prickly, porcupine-y kind of safe, but it feels like if anybody else gets in, they're going to get poked, and I won't get hurt. At some point, if you want to cheerfully love, if you want to have deep love for people, you're going to have to address those spiny, prickly, porcupine-y areas. And that's hard because you've suffered. And that's a hard thing to let go of. But it's one of the most practical things that we can do. It's one of the most helpful things we can do. It's one of the most transformational things we can do. And it's one of the most necessary things that we do to truly love others well. And there's a few others as well that are worth mentioning in the same category. Sometimes it's hard to love people deeply because, frankly, we're a little envious. I want what they have, or I wish they had to deal with what I have to deal with. Right? Or there's a level of judgment of, I think I'm better. Or in some cases, I think I'm worse, yep, and can never get to their level. And so at some point, if we want to have deep, cheerful, loving relationships, we have to get down below the surface with those things, and we have to invite God into that space. And so there again, it's like the 3rd time I'm mentioning the email address, but it's because we need help with this, right? You're not meant to do this alone. This entire message was about love, which means another person, yep, is involved. You may need another person to help you walk through this. So faithforward@cfcwire.org. We'll hook you up. But Mike, is there anything else in that category that you feel like you've learned practically or that you've just found helpful about either what you needed to do to love people that were hard to love, or that, maybe you haven't tried yet, but you heard somebody else say it and it seems smart?
Yeah, I think the only other thing I'll say about loving people who seem very difficult to love, gosh, I'm afraid that this isn't going to be practical enough. It's definitely a theological statement, but it's helped to guide me for sure. And that's that it's not personal. Like, life isn't personal. I know it feels personal, and at various points in the message I said that the gospel is personal, and it is, and that God is personal, and he is. But I just mean when other people sin against you, like, it's not personal in that sin is, it's everywhere. Like it's universal. And so when we are sinned against, it feels like we're being attacked by that person, but in reality, we're being attacked by the enemy. And so because it's not personal against you and that person, like you two are actually on the same team, you just don't know it yet, right?
Yeah.
So because it's not personal against that person, it really does allow you to get into a mindset of not allowing sin to win in this situation. And so that's been a really important philosophy for me, is not letting sin win. And in order to not let sin win, I've got to release that person from the grasp that sin holds on them. I've got to release them from responsibility. I mean, obviously it's their fault. They made choices, right? I'm sure that's very, very real. But there's an aspect to this that in order to get to this place of loving people who are difficult to like, we're going to have to get to a place where we're comfortable with the fact that sin is universal.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's going to be really helpful because, again, it doesn't excuse what happened. It doesn't excuse what happened to you. It does not say, well, it shouldn't bother you because everybody gets hurt and sins it, right? That's not the point, no. Right? But there's something about we're more able to forgive when we realize the extent to which we've needed to be forgiven. And not in a way that's transactional, where I sin this much, so I will forgive other people that sin this much. But the people that sin this much, I don't know, you're going to have to talk to somebody else, right? But it allows us to see the humanity of others. At the same time, those that have inflicted pain on you, you do not have to now go and become best friends with. Right? Again, this is not blanket coverage where you have to cheerfully love every single person the same way.
Yep.
But one of the things that you're going to find is that the things that were done to you by people that should have never happened, the effects of that in you will actually make it difficult to love the people you want to love. Take the perpetrator out for a second. Not dealing with the effects of the pain that we have experienced at the hands of people will make it harder to have deep love for the people that never did a thing to us. And so at some point, for our own good first, and then for the good of the people that we want to love and that God invites us to love, we have to get to those places.
Yeah.
So it brings us to a question that you had asked in the Sunday service, and I thought it was just one of those wonderful moments where nobody ever wants to be asked this question, but we need to, right? We need to get poked with it every once in a while, which is, where are you holding yourself back? And not only where are you holding yourself back, but specifically who? Who are you holding yourself back from? Is it God? Is it people that you're already in close relationship with? Is it people that you've been working really hard to keep out of relationship with? And like you said about the villain, what's the backstory? You know, what's the context? Have you explored your own origin story at a deeper level? And you gave a couple of examples. And so again, we're not trying to tell you shouldn't have gone to check out the service, because again, if you've only heard what we've said, you've missed a ton, including the opening story. But you give a couple of examples of, if you're the kind of person that's faking like everything's all right in your relationships, in your social relationships, is it any wonder that you're not experiencing deep love? If you're holding back your gifts in relationships, is it any wonder why there's a block in the level of influence you have? Like, if people would just listen to me, well, what are you holding back?
Yep.
If you project, and I did not like you for this one.
Oh.
I did not like this third one.
Me either.
If you project a persona of grumpy, dissatisfied, this is the one that landed, serious, is it any wonder that some of your relationships don't feel vibrant? And so you invited people to consider, well, where are you hiding and what parts of you are you hiding? And so again, anything there that feels practical?
Yeah, well, as we're talking about this, and you and I have been friends for a long time at this point, and we know each other fairly well. And so, one of the things that sticks out to me immediately is that in different ways, you and I both have dealt with this very issue of like projecting certain things to people, sometimes unintentionally.
Yep.
But you know, and we've actually had conversations about this where you've confronted me about things that I'm projecting that I don't mean to, or that I'm not, or that I am meaning to. And, you know, it's difficult for some of us. For you who are watching, give me an amen if this is you. But for introverts, it can be a little tricky sometimes navigating this. I'm sure extroverts have their version of it. I don't know what it is because I don't understand you people. But for introverts, it can be difficult because sometimes it feels, I don't know if it is, but it feels like a capacity issue. It feels like I've got people who I am my full self with. I have a handful of them, and everybody else can go away. And it's not not literally, right? But just in terms of like those deep kind of relationships, it when you, to use the, you know, you've got a certain amount of, you know, balls in your bucket, and when you talk or when you express yourself, those are taken out of the bucket, and that's the way that you categorize an introvert, is that expressing yourself is taking balls out of the bucket, whereas an extrovert, it's putting balls in the bucket when you express yourself, right? The way that I've tended to think about it, and I don't, you know, it's kind of have to explore if it's healthy or not, right? But like my thought process is I've only gotten a certain amount of these balls in this bucket, so I don't want every interaction to be me expressing the fullness of myself, because I don't want to reach empty.
Right.
I'm scared to reach empty. What happens to me if I reach empty? And so I don't know how practical that is for everyone watching, but I can just tell you that for me, I've had to in my mind ask myself the difficult question of, is it actually a capacity issue, or is there a deeper issue at play? Is there a lone wolf mentality? Is something that's not actually scriptural, not biblical, not of Jesus, or is it that I want to so bad? I want to express myself fully. I want to share with others around me, but it's a capacity thing. I can't do it with 100 people in a day. I can do it with about 5 or 6, right? Yep. And so those are the questions that I think we need to ask ourselves, and we need to invite God into that process so that we have an accountability against lying to ourselves, which I think we're liable to do. But I'm curious if that's similar for you, if that's a similar thing you've had to consider or not.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's so helpful to go back to one of your earlier points as well and tie it into this, is you have to understand your story. You have to understand your own story and the effects of your story. Right? And so for me, it's partially my introversion that makes me withhold or seem more serious sometimes. But frankly, it's also in my story. I moved around so much as a kid. I was in, 8 different houses by the time I was 9. And that was across 4 states. And so there was a lot of leaving. There was a lot of leaving and greeting. And it got to the point where in my young kid capacity, I feel like you either go to extremes, right, which seems to be the human reaction, right? Either I become so gregariously outgoing that I'm just like, hey, everywhere I go, or you sort of get quiet and you do a lot of listening first, and you do a lot of looking around first. And I went that route, and that's not right or wrong. It's just the way that I went. But then that meant that I became very guarded in what I allowed people to see, in part because it felt like, well, what's the point in letting them in? I'm just going to leave, or they're just going to leave. Yeah. And so we learn patterns of behavior without even intending to. So far back in your story that by the time you get to adulthood, we start using phrases like, well, it's just the way that I am. It's not. In some cases, it's not. Yeah. It's a pattern of behavior, and it's a pattern of protection. And that doesn't make it wrong, but it doesn't make it true. Mm-hmm. And that was one of the things that you ended with, was love is sharing the fullness of yourself with others for their benefit, and I would argue also for your own. Yeah. Because you've talked a lot about the benefit that you've derived from discovering the truth of who you are. Yep. Just for you. Forget all those other people. But those other people derive so much more benefit from authentic Mike than from any other version. And I've had to come to learn that as well, that There's been parts of myself that I wasn't sure how people were going to respond to it, so I hid. My wife and I joke that nobody else gets to see us the way we really are other than the two of us. Because, like, we're goofy at home. We are goofy. Like, we make bad jokes. We're corny. And nobody, well, you saw that because you and my wife work together, and you guys are like peas in a pod. But like, very few people see that side of me because I spent 30 some odd years suppressing it. And I've had to learn, and it's been painful. It's felt like a tearing. And again, this wasn't a sin issue. This was just parts of me that felt like, I don't know if this is safe. I don't know if this is good. I don't know if people will like this about me. And it turns out that some of the things that we hide from people are exactly the things that will reach them and touch them. And, for some people, you're terrified that your words don't matter, that people won't value your words. And so sometimes you never speak, but sometimes you never stop speaking because you're afraid that if somebody cuts you off, you'll never get the chance to say something again. And so it's just like word vomit every time you're around people, and it's actually making people want to not listen. And if you never share your words, then people never get to hear the value that you have. And so this isn't now work harder on your own. But again, it's ask God. Invite him into this space. Invite him to show you the things that you're hiding and the reasons you're hiding. And then it's going to take not just some thinking, but it's going to take some heart level risk to begin to do something in opposition to the way that you've always done it. And that feels a lot like suffering to keep the streak alive. But as we wrap up, one of the other things that you touched on, Mike, and so in just the last minute or two, you said that all of this, the combination of suffering and deep love and the suffering that's required for deep love, it changes as we have more of an eternal mindset than just fixed on the moment. So in the last moments that we've got, what do you want to elaborate on with that?
So going back to movies, the movies that change us. You ever see a movie and it changes you? And you hate to put movies up there with like the gospel, but sometimes you watch a movie and like it changes you every bit as much as like a really good sermon or like 4 months in a really great small group, right? Like you're just not the same. A lot of times what those movies do is they contextualize how short life is. And they frame it up in this kind of inspirational, do what you were created to do while you still have the chance. And while I recognize that can sound morbid, I think the way that Peter sets it up is it's meant to just help us put a proper framework around the roadblocks we put in front of us, the roadblocks on our path to loving people well, loving people deeply. And everything feels so big, and what that person did to you feels so big, and I'm not minimizing it. It was huge, but and then in the context of eternity, and the fact that you only get one life here on earth to help others and to be Jesus to other people, it just really makes things seem small. And so, I don't know how old you are watching this message, but I just crossed the threshold of 30, pretty recently. Not that recently. Time really flies. And so that's one of those thresholds that when you cross it, you start thinking, oh no. Not oh no, like it's almost over, but just like I'm not, and so I've started to think about life a little differently because I'm realizing that it is progressing. Time is moving at a very steady pace. And so I just think when we have that perspective that eternity is on the horizon, that life on this earth is not forever, and that God is going to reign for eternity, and that his kingdom is going to be set up a certain way. So why would we waste time here on earth bucking up against the way that we're going to spend eternity? We only get a certain amount of time, so let's do it right while we're here. Yeah. And so I think for me, that kind of perspective really helps to for me to navigate these things in a way that I think is a little bit healthier. Again, not to be morbid, but instead to be kind of inspirational in the way that those movies we love so much are inspirational.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It shifts our perspective on where we place value. You had talked about inviting kids in the neighborhood, the 1,000 or so kids, into your house and feeding them and doing a movie night. And the tension of kids eat a lot.
So much.
And you need to feed your own kids and yourself, and keep a roof over your head and these 1,000 children, right? And then at the same time, as we shift to more of an eternal mindset, as we shift to this sort of epic mentality of a larger story, you have those moments where you realize, looking back, the cost of something wasn't as significant in hindsight as it was in the moment.
Yeah.
That a year from now, and again, this doesn't go to extremes, because you do still have to feed your kids and keep a roof over your head, but marginal increase in grocery bill a year from now is not what you're going to be thinking about. You're going to be looking at these kids that you have relationships with and going, God, that was worth every penny, and I would have spent more.
Yeah.
And it's that notion. Again, it's not to run to the extremes immediately. All of this is within the context of ask God, but it helps us get over some of those pain points of, God, this is hurting. And sometimes he'll help us elevate our thinking to see the potential. And again, that doesn't excuse dismissing pain.
Right.
It doesn't excuse unhealthy, toxic relationships. But in these places of stretching and tension, sometimes the thing that helps us get over the hump is asking God to show us the way that he sees it. So, as always, there's so much more that we could talk about. And so if you haven't already, send Mike some emails at faithforward@cfcwire.org. But as we so often say, we're still obviously on this journey as well.
Yeah.
Whether it's me and Mike or Brian or Lee or whoever sits in this other chair, somebody's going to sit here someday. It's going to be great. I'm going to watch it. But we're still very much on our own journey. And we're grateful that you give us the space to be on our journey with you. And we're grateful that you've invited us to be on your journey. And so until the next time, thanks for being a part of this.